when you have the CEO of the company going on 60 Minutes, look, ma, no hands, that's a problem. And from the regulatory side, that is off-label promotion of a way of a regulatory product is being abused.
The Tesla Q podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended for and should not be used as financial, investment, or trading advice. Research associated with fiscal decisions should be conducted elsewhere. The host of the show possesses no license or credentials to warrant accepting advice based on what is heard on the Tesla Q podcast. Additionally, even though the host and guests may hold positions in companies discussed on the show, they don't have insights into the next time step of the simulation. Therefore, do not make any financial decisions based on the contents of this podcast.
Hello and welcome to episode number 40 of the Tesla Q podcast. This episode is being recorded on July 31st, 2019. As always, remember to go to patreon.com/TeslaQ podcast if you'd like to become a contributor to the podcast. Today's episode is going to be an interview with Melayna Lokosky. She runs killingmycareer.com, if I'm not mistaken. I'll have her tell more about that in just a little bit. But before we get to the interview, I see just now that Tesla has filed 2 Form 4s, one of which is for J.B. Straubel selling another block of 15,000 shares apparently. But also, Robin Denholm, the chairman of Tesla, has purchased 1,000 shares on the open market. So JB has sold 15,000. Robin Denholm, with the honorific title of chairman, has purchased 1,000. And if I'm not mistaken, JB has 3 more blocks of 15,000 that he's going to be selling in the near future. So I won't be surprised to see a few more Form 4s over the next few days. So enough of the intro. Time to get into the interview. As I mentioned, I'm here today with Melayna Lokosky. Welcome to the podcast, Melayna, for episode number 40.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Many of you probably have come across Melayna on Twitter. Is your handle Killing My Career?
It is, or also my name, at Melayna Lokosky.
Okay, and so let's just get started with telling you a little bit about yourself, or telling us a little bit about yourself, I should say.
Well, I think, as you said, everyone kind of probably is aware of me on Twitter to some extent, and the Killing My Career is based off of my time as a federal whistleblower. And I thought that was a good way to put it, because that's exactly what any whistleblower ends up doing, essentially, is if you come forward, you end up killing your career. So it's not a big deal. It's not a martyr situation. It's just a fact. And there are people that go through this that lose a lot more than a career. Killing My Career came about because, obviously, as a federal whistleblower, and that was one of the things that the FBI sat down with me the very first day and said, well, you do know that you'll lose all your friends and you are killing your career, essentially, is it. And when I worked for a Clarent, or Johnson & Johnson's a Clarent, there was always talk about, oh, someone should be a whistleblower. And the joke was always, oh, but you'll kill your career if you do that. So that's kind of how that came about.
So you kind of adopted that into your own brand and have made a new career out of it, it seems like.
Absolutely. I kind of knew that going into that was going to have to, it was going to have to take on a different life from what I had done for, 15 years. So, yes. So
what do you do now as Killing My Career?
I do some consulting, very small. I don't have any desire to be scalable to anything more than 1 or 2 clients a year. Usually in 3 to 6 month contracts is what I work. It's all self-funded companies between $5 and $20 million.
Okay. So you help consult people that are going through similar situations to what you went through?
It can be. Some of it is for attorneys, things like that. A lot of what I do for the pro bono side is to help groups or organizations become familiar with Twitter. An example, who were injured by surgical mesh. What I was able to do is actually help get them on Twitter. And you don't think that that's a big deal, but when you're talking about women who have been injured and are 70 or 80 years old, that's a process in and of itself. So that's a lot of what I do for my nonprofit side, is to try to help unmarket what these companies have marketed, essentially, is it.
Okay. And you also have a website, I think, where you have some case studies and stuff like that?
That's the Killing My Career. So I started that in 2014 while I was under SEAL, and did that basically to hold both the government and Johnson & Johnson accountable. And about the third day out on that, I got a call from my FBI handlers, both of them, and said that, Sarah Bloom, who is she's the Assistant Attorney General, is not very happy. And I said, well, neither am I. So we're even, essentially, is it? And that's why I did that, though, is not to be like a petulant child and stomp my foot. It was to try to hold both sides accountable during that process. So that's how that essentially started. But what I did was look at what I was doing with the government and basically putting it out on the website simultaneously without divulging that I was the whistleblower, because that's illegal. So I kind of found a loophole, and was hoping that media would take more notice of it so that some of those stories would get out sooner, such as Theranos. If they had started that in 2014, Uber, some of the startups like that, that was the goal. But
So you were doing that during the process of being a whistleblower?
correct.
So how did you balance that?
That was pretty much my full-time job at that point, a non-paid job. So I had sold everything I owned and moved back in with my parents at that point. I was no longer able to be employed by the industry that I had been for 15 years. So I used to get like 6 calls at least a month from recruiters, and everything dried up. So I sat down with my parents and said, here's kind of what I'm thinking of doing, is that they've always taught me that things are bigger than myself, and they are. So kind of going back to the DOJ, they said, well, we'll let you keep your site up, but you got to expand beyond just Johnson & Johnson. So that's when I got into the venture capital side of things. So kind of having that conversation with my parents and with the DOJ, and just said, well, this is kind of what I'm going to do here for the next, I think it was about 3 years I was doing that. So at the same time.
So what was the timeline of, like, between you becoming a whistleblower, leaving your job, and once everything played out with your whistleblower experience?
So January 4th, 2011, I was wrongfully terminated from Johnson & Johnson at Clarent. And then July 2011, I was in Boston, sitting across the table from the Department of Justice, and the FBI, CMS, which is healthcare, Medicare, Medicaid, the DoD, the Department of Defense, and trying to think who else. Oh, the FDA. So pretty much everybody was in the room at the same time. And my attorneys had told me going into that if everyone's in the room, it's a pretty big deal. If only one person or 2 people are there, they're probably not interested in the case. So when I saw everybody there, it was kind of a sobering moment.
So you left your job, or you were terminated in January, and then in July you were giving information over?
Yes, that was my first meeting with the Department of Justice, was July 2011. August 2011, I was already wearing a wire and had recorded, I think, more hours on a wire than the person who did the Pfizer case, is what my FBI agent told me, kind of as a joke. He's like, you could certainly get people to talk.
So how did you get people to talk? Like, was it just social gatherings or what?
Part of it is, and it's a lot, and I guess I'll kind of toggle back and forth between Tesla, but it's a lot where people get pissed off at the company. The employees are there and they're angry. So it wasn't hard to get people to talk, because they were angry about the same things I was angry about. We were trying to fix the problems. And I think that's the hard part, is that you realize that these companies don't want to fix the problems. They want to eliminate the person who is exposing the problems.
Because problems equal costs to them.
Correct. And the really sad part, and the part that was really, I think, even hard for the DOJ to get, companies knowingly and willingly build a fraud into the business model. And that's what I had to do the case studies for, to basically show that, and over and over and over again, where in the case of Clarent, I was able to go back to 2014 and almost to the exact day that they decided to commit fraud. And the fraud didn't start until 2018. So for 4 years, they knew they were going to do that.
So this was fairly recent then, long after you were terminated.
No, that was
Or,
2004. So
so
not
2004.
14. So yeah.
Okay.
So way back. And then to take you through the rest of the timeline then. So from 2011 to 2012, I wore wire and did all that stuff. And then I think it was 2012, the subpoenas were served on the company. So then my time with the wire and stuff was a lot less. But during that time, I had daily call-ins with my FBI handler. So we would spend probably 30 minutes a day on the phone for over 7 months, kind of game planning everything. Who did I talk to? What information did I get? Who should they talk to next? Kind of helping out in that sense.
Okay. So was there a reward ultimately from your being a whistleblower?
It's funny because the DOJ calls it, an award. I think it was a job for that many years. So to put it in context, I was making $250,000 a year when I lost my job, and in the amount of time that it took, the full 5 years to get through that, I would have made more money if I had kept my mouth shut than if I had done it. So yes, you do get compensated, but I think that part of the manipulation from the companies and also from the government is to focus on what the whistleblower gets out of it without asking the bigger questions. Where does that money go? The government recovered $18 million from that case. Where does that money go? Does it go back into healthcare? And it was another sobering moment when I was sitting, across the table from one of our many meetings and asked, where does that money go? And everybody looked at each other in the room and they're like, we don't know.
Yeah, I think I was listening to some podcast recently. I don't remember what it was, but they were talking about SEC whistleblower awards, and apparently that money just goes into the general fund and doesn't go. It actually might have been something else besides those fines, but basically it just goes into the general fund and doesn't necessarily go towards anything related to what the fine was for, which doesn't really make sense. But
and I had tried.
That's how the federal budgeting process works. So,
well, and part of what I had asked is, you have to solve the problem, but you also have to put sort of parameters in there to make sure that it doesn't happen again and to hold, accountable. And I had suggested one of the things that the company could no longer get subsidies or non-restricted educational grants for a certain amount of time, that you have to put something in place that prevents them from doing it. A fine is not enough. Even putting executives in jail is not enough. It has to be something that's going to hurt them long-term financially. And they all looked and they're like, that's a great idea, but you're creating laws. Like, well, goodness, they're logical. That's the problem, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Laws require an act of Congress usually. So
yep.
There's a reason that saying that something's an act of Congress is a saying. So, without getting into anything too gruesome for the podcast, since this is a family-friendly podcast here, could you just describe what the fraud was that you uncovered a little bit, like what all it entailed as far as financials or whatever?
Absolutely. I think the best way to describe it is the way I described it to the DOJ. So I put a PowerPoint presentation together when I went and met with them. And the way I explain it is that if you think of a drinking straw, just a regular straw that has a bunch of holes in it, and you're FDA cleared, it's called a 510K clearance, you're cleared to drink water saline through that straw. Then doctors can look at that and say, well, we also realized that we could drink soda through that straw. That's called off label. We can't talk to them about it. If the doctor figures it out on their own, they can do that. The third application for the straw is to snort cocaine through it. That's pretty much what our company did. We went straight from being cleared to drink water through it, teaching doctors how to snort cocaine through it. And that's just kind of the analogy. They weren't really snorting cocaine through it, but I think it's just to give you sort of a way to explain how they went through the regulatory process and they completely ignored it. They knew that what they were doing was wrong. And we didn't know as reps at the time that they had tried to get it approved the right way with a drug in this device, not just the saline. And it was denied by the FDA. So when we were hired, they kind of said, well, we're going to get the approval for this, but the FDA doesn't know what they're doing. And, a lot like the people at Tesla, you tend to believe what you're told, and they don't come in the very first day at the job and say, okay, here's all the fraud we're going to commit. And they put it out in a nice book for you. It's very subtle. It's over time. It's pushing boundaries. It's grooming. It's a lot of what I write about on Twitter about how they look for easily manipulated CEOs who, that sort of scenario. It's the same thing with the reps. It goes down that same sort of thing where they groom you. You're making really good money. So, hey, you're already doing this. How about you do this too? So it's kind of a bit of a manipulation from that standpoint.
Yeah, I think Elizabeth Holmes is one person that you reference fairly frequently.
Yes, she is one of the poster children for that. Travis Kalanick is another one that I call them CEOs because there is no way in hell these people should ever be CEOs. And then when you dial it back and you look at it, you're like, yeah, they shouldn't. They don't have the qualifications.
Like a 20-year-old that has finished like less than 2 years of college should be a CEO of a company that makes this device that tests blood. Yeah. In retrospect, it just sounds hilariously silly, but people believed it. They ate it up. So,
and I think the part that most people miss about the Holmes Theranos thing is that from the very beginning, if you understood the whole process of the approval, they were only cleared or approved for one test. So when I write about all the time about false claims, or the false sales projections to give the appearance of hypergrowth, that's what they did. They set all the quotas, though, off of 250 tests. So 249 tests were 100% fraud out of the gate. And I was like, how is nobody? I'm like, hello? Anybody catching this? Like, how is no one seeing this? And it was very frustrating. But fortunately, at that time, I did have a dialogue, obviously, with the FBI and the DOJ, and would kind of point these things out saying, listen, what you're seeing at mine. And I kind of joke that if you think of fraud as a head of hair plugs full of hair. The Clarent fraud is like one tiny little hair on the head. And, maybe the Theranos one is two little hairs. So it's small in comparison to what the fraud is, but it's the pattern of the fraud that was so important that you can see it being encouraged, replicated, and rewarded in Silicon Valley. So you see it with Theranos, you see it with Uber, and you'll see it post after the IPO as well.
Yeah, I think there may be some things there with Tesla's autopilot and some of their claims. And the fact that they're actually selling it already when there's not really a regulatory process in place yet for that.
That's insane to me. The idea that there is no regulatory body that oversees this and we're allowing criminals to self-regulate and self-report. The number one thing that happens in startups is that they underreport the adverse events because it, as you said, it hurts their profit. So you can never expect a company like Tesla to report any problems that they have. And I think that there was the case up in San Francisco recently where the person said that the owner of the car, not the driver that killed the gentleman, but the owner said something about that it's self-erased. It didn't self-erase.
Yeah.
That's no.
With that particular incident, I thought I read that the San Francisco Police Department did actually get the data from the car, but I might have heard that wrong. But
well, even if they get the data, do they know what they're doing with the data? And that's not a dig to the police. That's not their area. And that's where there's an issue and a problem with this regulatory and compliance component of it. We think about it from the world of medical devices, that there's the FDA there that's supposed to help people, doesn't always. This is so much more dangerous in that context because you have thousands of people. I don't know how many people own Teslas, but you have those people out there who clearly have no regard for their own lives, let alone anybody else's. Autopilot, and you're not paying attention. And I get that those are the extreme cases that we see, on Twitter and that sort of thing. But I think that it happens more often than the company is certainly willing to admit. And when you have the CEO of the company going on 60 Minutes, look, ma, no hands, that's a problem. And from the regulatory side, that is off-label promotion of a of a way of a regulatory product is being abused. So that would go under either a false claims sort of deal or off-label promotion. And I get that's normally for the medical device world, but I think that would apply, and the language needs to start reflecting that in this situation.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like a direct analogy to my ears, at least. The way that you described the fraud that you uncovered with the off-label straw and the cocaine, that made me think immediately of Boeing's recent incident where they already had the 737 approved by the FAA, and whoever it was, Rolls-Royce or GE, I'm not sure which company, but they had a more efficient engine, but the engine itself had a different aerodynamic profile, so they had to adjust some things, but they still called it a 737 MAX so that they could more quickly get it through the FAA's approval processes. That sounds, and then they tried to compensate with software and all this other stuff. And I know Elmer Fudd, one of our favorite humorous Twitter characters, has really been harping on Boeing lately. Also Ted Stein has, but that sounds like a very similar situation of going off label and trying to skirt through the regulatory process.
Well, and that's it. And I always say that it's innovation used as manipulation to evade regulatory and compliance laws. And that's not exclusive just to Silicon Valley or just to venture capital funded startups. You're seeing it everywhere. And to your point, Elmer just sent me an article about that today, which is on my to-do reading list that is about that. And he and I went back and forth about there's counterfeit parts too. So that's the other thing that's a really big concern, is that it's happening in medical devices where it's a type of plastic that the companies here would no longer produce it because it was not meant to be implanted in humans. So I still think it's a RICO case from Boston Scientific. They allegedly basically farmed that whole piece out to China and brought it back in the country. You're going to see more of that in other industries, not just the medical devices. You're going to see it in aviation. It's happened, it's some in the spinal cages. So when you're talking about putting it in a body, that's one thing. When you're putting it in a plane where there's, hundreds of people on it, all of this is so dangerous. And people think that white collar fraud it's a financial fraud. There's a reason I call these people serial killer CEOs, because that's exactly what they are.
So you mentioned that you worked for, is it Acclarent?
Acclarent.
Acclarent. So was that who you worked for 15 years? Or Johnson proper?
Oh, no, I worked for a bunch of startups from pharma and medical device for 15 years. So I was at Acclarent for, I think it was 2007 to 2011.
Okay. So through those different jobs, though, you are familiar with the FDA's approval processes and stuff. Could you just describe some of your background in that regard and knowledge?
Sure. And I also have a thing on YouTube that I did when I was at the FDA in 2016. And one of the biggest problems is that even the FDA didn't get that there's a difference between pharmaceuticals and medical devices as far as kind of the road to getting them approved and why they exist in different universes, essentially, is it. And so on the pharma side, you get an FDA approval. You have clinical trials and you get it approved. You have a patent on that for 7 years. And that's where they make their money in that time. On the pharmaceutical or the medical device side, and I don't think a lot of people get this, is that like 95% of all medical devices are venture capital funded startup first. So there is a formula out there that the VCs want 8 to 10 times back their original investment in 3 to 5 years. The only way that happens is through fraud. So what they want to do for capital side of the startups is that they will ignore the regulatory process. So that process is there's 3 ways to get a medical device approved. One is the 510K, and that's substantial equivalence. And the way I describe that is that you have to have a product that is similar to something else. You can say that my product is similar to candy, but you and I both know that if you put taffy in your mouth, it's very different than if you put cotton candy in your mouth. But that's how we're approving medical devices. We're saying it's candy. and we know that these two things are completely different in the way that they are metabolized or used in the body. And that is the loophole that VCs are famous for. And Josh Mackauer, who was one of the co-founders of my company, Clarent, is famous for saying that if you make small, subtle changes to the 510K, you can get it through regulatory. Fantastic.
Is he proud of being known for that, or?
I would say he probably was. So he's also with NEA, which is the world's largest venture capital firm. I think they have $17 billion in outlying capital. So when you think about that, they want 8 to 10 times that back in 3 to 5 years, and it's rinse and repeat. So he's been there a very long time, and there are a group of people that are involved in that they also funded Assure, which I don't know if you guys have followed that on the Tesla Q side at all, but that's the permanent birth control that was Conceptus and was purchased by Bayer as Assure. There's tens of thousands of women that are in federal court right now fighting to get this product removed from their body. To bring in a Neuralink sort of side to this, where Musk is talking about just shoving stuff on top of the brain. If you put a polypropylene in the part of a body, you don't know what it's going to do. What it's happening is with the mesh from the Gynecare mesh to the Assure device is that it is actually breaking apart in the body, and it is migrating. So if you think of, I'm trying to think of a way to describe this. The mesh, and this is probably graphic, but I think it tells a good story, is the mesh is actually penetrating the vaginal wall and cutting men's penises. Oh. So that's how it's migrating. So when you say that, men are like, oh, wait, I think I should pay attention to this now. Yeah,
but
I would guess that with some female healthcare issues, and venture capitalists maybe being more predominantly male, they might not listen to, or might not really internalize some of the problems that might be arisen, but that really makes it hit home.
Yes. Yeah. So that's kind of, I think, when you think about what they're trying to do, they don't look at the long-term effects of what this is going to do. So in the instance of mesh cases, and I actually just tweeted this out about how, everybody's like, well, when is the recall going to happen with autopilot? To give context, it took over 7 years for the mesh women to get the FDA to finally make a move on that. And not all of it is removed, but they're slowly forcing the companies to take that product off the market. But that took 7 years. Again, in context, I think that it should go faster on autopilot. To Musk's own genius, it is easier to remove that product than it is a surgical device from somebody's body or medical device from somebody's body. So that is a simple update, a software update. He was so proud about how he could, put that in cars. Oh, great, let's take it out.
It would be very easy to disable. I think the current body count directly related to autopilot is somewhere in the range of 4 as far as definitive deaths from autopilot. So I made a tweet a few days ago. It might have been over the weekend. My guess is that once that number hits 10, I hope that something's done by the time it hits 10. Somebody had said that thousands may die before something's done, but I really hope I hope it doesn't get above 10. That's my personal hope. So,
well, I appreciate that, but I'm going to tell you it's going to be closer to 100 before that happens, unfortunately. If you think about GM and the ignition switch, it was well over 100. It was 104 by the time that got pulled. To that point, Mary Barrow was with GM since 1986 as an engineer. Anybody who's ever worked for a company where you move up the ranks, you know that there are problems. You may not definitively have, all your I's dotted and T's crossed, but at least anecdotally, that there are problems with a product. It wasn't until I think, 2014 or 15 ignition switches were pulled, but they knew about it. Court documents show that they knew about it all the way back in 2010. So I think that and this was a very sobering moment for me, was through all of this, realizing that recalls don't happen because a company has the goodness of their heart to decide that that's what they want to do. It is 100% done, at least in my experience with everything I've researched, it is done when a company is under DOJ criminal investigation, sealed. And basically, the company is given the option. You either are going to be sued by the government criminally and civilly, or you can agree to decide to pull this product right now. You're still going to get charged and fined for it, but we're not going to criminally go after you. And that's the negotiation that happens behind closed doors. You saw it with GM, you saw it with Toyota. I think it'll be interesting to see. Volvo just had a couple of recalls. I guarantee you that those are probably also part of a DOJ investigation that's currently sealed. I think that we know that Tesla is already under DOJ criminal investigation. It's for Model 3 false projections. But once you're in the door, you can really kind of broaden the scope of your investigation. So I imagine that that'll be part of that.
Yeah, one aspect of my maybe naive hope that the body count only gets to 10 is the existence of PAVE, the organization. I forget what exactly that stands for, but it's Partnership for Automotive Vehicle something education, I think. But basically every other company that's involved with trying to develop autonomous driving is part of this organization, and the one glaring omission is Tesla. So that's part of my naive hope that the body count doesn't rise above 10. So.
Well, no, and it's not naive. It's a fantastic, listen, it's a great outlook. And I get accused all of the time of being negative. Maybe I am, but I'm realistic based on facts. And one of the things that you have to think about is that the first to market makes the most money. So Johnson & Johnson CEO and worldwide president Alex Gorsky famously has said, it doesn't have to be 100% right. You get it 60% right and go. Think about that in a medical device. Now 60%. We're thinking about 60%. And then now if you think of that in the context of autopilot, I'm going to say that even though that they're saying that there's 4 deaths, again, they underreport adverse events. So as part of that fraud formula that I put out on Twitter, give the appearance of hypergrowth. Part of that is they underreport the adverse events. In the sales rep side of things from the medical device world, we got in trouble if we reported adverse events or accidents. It's a federal thing called MAUDE, MAUDE, and I cannot for the life of me tell you what it stands for right now. But basically, it's for companies to report when there's a medical device adverse event or there's a problem, a death associated with it. That thing is ridiculous. Things disappear off there all the time. I was tracking all that. I had to take screenshots because from one day to the next, things were missing. I'm like, that's fraud. The next day it's gone. So it's amazing.
Following Tesla on Twitter is what got me into really taking tons of screenshots, especially with Elon's tweets.
Oh, absolutely. And listen, I've done the same for NEA and all these things because the number one thing criminals love to do is rewrite history. And, I think one of the things that's really missed, I guess I would say, from the media standpoint on things is that I think it was 2016, 17, Elon Musk made a comment about SpaceX, how he was looking for volunteers, basically on a suicide mission to Mars. People kind of were like, ugh. Like, you just basically said you are okay with killing people. That's not what innovation is. It's not that you're kind of calculating in the death toll for people. It's to avoid deaths is it. So he's basically out there saying, yeah, I'm good with killing people and I'm going to need some volunteers. Then he backpedaled it in 2018, was like, yeah, I'll go to Mars too. We all know he's not going anywhere, hopefully, but federal prison. But it's the idea, though, that when somebody tells you who they are, it's that, famous Maya Angelou quote that when somebody tells you who they are, believe them. Mm-hmm. He has told you that he wants to kill people over and over and over again. How is the media still not making that link, though, to autopilot? He is okay with killing people. Start calling him out on that.
Move fast and break things, right?
Yeah, that I've Twitter. I never heard that in Silicon Valley. I just always, I always heard the manipulation of the cocktail napkin story. I think I talk about that quite a bit, about how Clarence, we heard that, they were sitting on somebody's front porch, and who has cocktail napkins on their front porch, first of all, but, it was and we sketched this out. I come to find out later that even the original device at a Clarence was stolen. Another big thing in Silicon Valley is patent theft, which also Musk has been accused of. So I think that there's a lot of overlap that even though Musk is and Tesla is not a startup, I laugh when people say that because
they're 16 years old.
And he would have been fired like it's 6 months in. If you are not profitable in a venture capital funded startup, you do not have a job in 6 months. That's including rep all the way up the line.
Well, I think part of the problem with Tesla is that Elon was the lead of the round A funding, I think. So the fact that he put his own money in, I think probably gave him a lot more leeway than a typical early investor or manager would have.
That's also manipulation, I think, if you look at it that way, where it's that he's saying, well, look, I put money in. Well, let's look at how much he got out in subsidies. So he looks like he's putting skin in the game, but what is he taking out the back end of it? That's where,
He's taking a lot out. I had another thought, and it slipped my mind. How about we go ahead and start talking about Neuralink a little bit?
Sure.
Their investor day a couple weeks ago. I forget the exact day. July 16th, I think. That's when it was, but I haven't actually read the paper in depth. I do have it printed out in front of me here, and I
don't waste your time.
I fell asleep during the presentation because it started at like 11 o'clock my time, and I was pretty tired. So,
well, and honestly, it was like an incubator pitch, and I don't ever want to insult and demean anybody. I don't know if everybody knows what an incubator is or not, but an incubator is where the idea starts. So before you even get VC funding, you have a group of people that sit around. It's usually engineers, a doctor, and that's where all your ideas come from. What he gave as a Neuralink presentation was 100% like just sitting around a room bullshitting for, sorry, I'm totally blank now, but yes, thank you, for the incubator. And that's where I was like, and he's a terrible speaker to begin with. Listen, I get it's hard, all that stuff, but he's awful. He doesn't well, it's terrible.
That's actually part of what really pushed me towards the Tesla Q side of things. Was in early 2018, I was starting to get kind of bigger into following some space related stuff. And I watched one of his presentations for SpaceX, and I was dumbfounded at how bad of a public speaker he is, which Tesla Charts mentioned that on his interview with Quote the Raven over the weekend. He's definitely not a great public speaker.
And he doesn't practice. Like anyone I know that's going to do a pitch, especially, and that was an investor pitch is what that was. Make no mistake, that was nothing more than just throwing the net out to see who wants to get involved in it. But I have seen some really great speakers and I've seen some really terrible speakers. I've also been on the development side of creating pitch decks for VCs or, to get bigger investors, that sort of thing. And I always worked with those people to make sure that you can articulate what you need to, that you've got anything that's worth more than 10 slides, you've lost people. Like I have a 10 slide rule for anything. I'm like, if it is longer than 10, learn to edit because and that white paper, sorry, do not get me started on that thing.
I haven't read through it yet. I will note that the acknowledgments section is less than 3 full lines. And it does not mention the Department of Defense or DARPA, which is who actually developed the quote sewing device that's supposedly going to implant these really thin wires into your brain. Which the very next day after the presentation, DARPA tweeted that was their invention. It's a little bit of a subtle, not so subtle jab at Elon.
Oh, I saw that. I was proud of them for that. I thought that's good. And that's what he needs, is to be held accountable for all the times that he takes credit for other people's work.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that pitch was a fundraising pitch, basically. All of Neuralink, if I'm not mistaken, I think all of Neuralink's funding up before that was probably from Elon directly, or maybe a few other people.
I'll put that into context for you too. I think it was like he's put 150 million in. I keep seeing different numbers. So let's just be conservative and say he's put 100 million in. Acclarent, and again, top to bottom fraud, only raised 100 million and sold in like, I think it was 4 years, and sold for 785 million and had actual viable products. The idea that he spent 100 million and doesn't even have anything that is through or even close to the FDA process yet is like, it's an absolute joke. So anybody that's in the industry, I talked to a bunch of my friends that are still in the industry, and they're all like, what is this? They're like, do people get that this is like the biggest joke? I'm like, I'm pretty sure. And I laugh because everybody's like, it's not peer reviewed. I'm like, who is going to be his peer reviewer? He's not a doctor. He's not an engineer. Who is his peer?
Elon has no peers. Come on. Wait.
Well, I saw something, and I would love to give credit, and I can't remember who said it, but they're like, is his drug dealer his peer? And I was like, oh, I get so angry when I see those. I'm like, I wish I would have been smart enough and snarky enough to come up with that.
Yeah. It's always fun when you think of a joke just too late.
Oh yeah, no, but that's accurate though, and that's where this idea that my favorite though, and I forget the dude's name, that is white shirt dude that was standing next to him that was grinning from ear to ear when Elon pulled out, and we've done it on monkeys. Like you could just see everybody who has ever done medical devices cringe, because it is done all the time. It has to be in order to be able to get a product approved, but not at that stage and not at that level. And you could tell that Elon was pissed that, I forget the other guy that called him out the day before, that was basically like, yeah, this thing is not ready. So it was like an ego thing. You could tell he was challenged and it escalated. Like, that's fun for me to watch, is when he's challenged and how it escalates. Like, I use a lot of red flags on Twitter for that. I'm like, you could see the escalation right here. And speaking of Tesla charts and doing that podcast, that totally escalated him to tweet about the whatever it is for the solar panel
spooling up. Yeah.
100%. And that's what I made a joke about it on Twitter. I'm like, that's what the FBI calls baiting. I mean, they should probably cut TC a check for that, because it was fantastic. But that's where I think that's what I'm trying to do with the sociopathic business model, is to get people to see these patterns, that not only is it ridiculous that there's something that he says that is just so, it's like, it's a farce, but also what you can do to prevent that, or what you can do to protect yourself from that sort of thing. So it's oh. And
back to the funding topic, when I was thinking about that, I thought, oh yeah, Steve Jurvetson just provided some funding for one of Elon's companies, but that was actually the Boeing company and not Neuralink. So that was not subsequent to this most excellent Neuralink presentation that they gave on July the 16th. But it was more for the Las Vegas People Mover Tunnel. Yeah,
I can't figure out. It's like a stage show every day. You know, it is like a new sort of juggling act of where can we get money and how can we get it. And I think people are starting to catch on to some degree that is happening. But I think that there are people that still, I guess, pray to the Church of Elon. And that's the other reason I write a lot about astroturfing. I think that there's a lot of people that think that there's more people that really agree with him than do. For those that aren't familiar, astroturfing is when a company pays a third-party company to do marketing for them. It's usually like assault marketing. So it's to combat anything that's negative and truthful. So it's to combat Tesla Q. And essentially what it does is that they're, okay with doxing, but what they do is they try to keep their clients hands free. So that's why they'll use a third party usually to create these campaigns. Early on in Tesla Q, probably maybe March, April, somewhere of last year, there were certain phrases that were coming out. And one of them was about me wanting to F Elon. And I created a quip that I guess counterbalanced that is the right way to put it.
Yeah, I think it made it onto a coffee mug, if I'm not mistaken.
I'm very proud of that, I will say. And but the point of me doing that wasn't just to be snarky. I mean, that's fun. But what it does is it counteracts that. So then they take out of the cycle, then essentially is it. So you don't see that anymore about me wanting to do that, or any woman who is, standing up to him wanting to do that. There was another comment about, being cat ladies. I saw it with myself, and I think maybe Jen, a couple other people were called, oh, you're the cat ladies. I made a comment that was also not so kind. Didn't make it on a mug, thankfully. My parents would not have been proud of that one. But what that did then is it takes that language out of circulation. So if you see me being aggressive and doing that, there's a reason for it. So that part of it too is that we're seeing a lot less of "have you driven one?" It's the same thing. So you start to see that, that pattern. The other pattern I thought was interesting is that Elon spelled autopilot with a capital A and a capital P. That was on purpose. It was so that all the bots then picked up that same language, essentially, as it with the AP. I pointed that out on Twitter. Right away, that goes away. He's back to spelling it correct. So it's just because, and again, that was taught to me by the FBI doing my case. I didn't realize what astroturfing was before that. I'd heard of it. I didn't think it was as prevalent. I guess.
I think with Tesla, it seems to be very prevalent.
With any company, though, like I was really surprised that women who were injured by Assure were getting doxxed. Like people were calling their doctors. The same thing for the gynecare women. And, it's one thing that you guys are fighting from the financial side. Obviously, you've morphed into the philanthropic side of things and the safety and protection side. But these were women who were fighting also injured. So they're fighting these companies that have billions of dollars. They're injured. Their families are being doxxed. And you're like, how are these companies so evil? So for what you see on the Tesla side of things, and it's bad, Elon is an idiot, which is different. Most of these other CEOs are at least smart enough to kind of keep their hands out of it. He can't help himself. So that makes it fun from me in the cheap seats. And it makes it easy for the FBI. I say it every day. He makes their job so easy. He does their job for them. I mean, it's amazing.
So back to Neuralink a little bit. From your perspective, they're very, very far from having anything FDA approved for human trials or even proper monkey trials, or what would you say in that regard?
Well, I think I had read, and I've seen two different things. So one thing said they were going for FDA clearance. The other was saying that they were going for de novo. That's kind of a new sort of thing where they're trying to get things, through in a different way. And then there's something called a PMA, and I forget what it stands for. But essentially, it's when you have a drug and a device together in a system. So he would have to go 510K, I would think, for that. And I just don't see that happening. The other thing that concerns me, and I wrote about this on Twitter as well, is that there is always a war between certain doctors and surgeons. So there's a neurologist who, studies the brain in that sense. Then there's the neurosurgeon who actually does the surgery. We saw it with cases of GERD where some doctors were surgeons, so general surgeons were doing the procedure, and then some gastroenterologists were doing it. If you run into a problem as a gastroenterologist while you're doing a surgical procedure, you have to then send them to a surgeon in the middle of a procedure. So it's very dangerous in some contexts. So the idea that he's doing this sewing machine thing is, I think, to make it so that more people can do the procedure. That's the goal of any medical device, is that the biggest manipulation is in the hands of a good surgeon, it makes them great. In the hands of an average surgeon, it makes them better. That's a manipulation. So they have to get more doctors doing the procedure in order to make the money. And so that's where I feel like he's opening it up to have it be like an in-office procedure. Like, I think, what did they say? It was like going to the dentist or something, or I forget what it was. He gave it
LASIK, I think is what they.
That's it. LASIK. Yes. So it's like LASIK. No, it's not. It's brain surgery.
Yeah, it's quite a bit different than LASIK. One thing that I actually finished listening to an episode of a podcast just earlier tonight. It was an interview with the guy who's the CEO of Control Labs, and they're using the interface with neurons and nerves and such, but they're not doing it invasively. They're using like bracelets around people's hands, and they're doing some really cool stuff. But they're doing it, from my view, in a much more measured, much more responsible manner than what it looks like Neuralink's planning to do, which is just to go straight into the brain. Have you heard of Control Labs any? Or
I haven't, and I'll certainly look into that. It's interesting, and I do know that there's some, like, I'm thinking it's Nevro. There's a couple of different ones. Boston Scientific has one. Medtronic has, where they're doing things like that for depression, for PTSD. There are nerve stimulators that are already out there, but as you said, it's not implanted in the skull base, which is, and to the point before about Neuralink, where he's talking about putting like a polypropylene, which is a plastic on the brain that we don't know what it's going to do. So if it breaks apart, just like it did in women's bodies and migrated into really not great places, that thing could migrate down into the brain and cause brain damage or strokes. And there was no talk of that at all, like nothing. And I just was like, and I laughed that they put out something about the next day, like, I think that they were mad that everybody was chirping about it on Twitter. And I forget the language that they put, but like, if you're qualified to speak about this. And I'm thinking, Elon Musk is not qualified to speak about this.
Yeah,
like,
of all people.
Joke. Yes.
Well, that company, I think, is funded by Lux Capital, which is who Josh Wolf is a partner at. And, of course, Josh and Elon have had some back and forth on Twitter at different times. But in a way, I thinking about that company, Control Labs, and Josh Wolf and his approach to things, in a way, and the fact that he's a venture capitalist, so he is providing funding for these companies, which is basically how Elon got started with Tesla. In a way, I feel like Elon's maybe just kind of jealous of Josh and his approach, and maybe jealous of the fact that Josh has not yet had to do anything to be as fraudulent as Elon has, maybe. But
I'm going to get myself in hot water here. I think it's hard for me because I like people personally, and then I also see what they do in a different context. I think Josh is seems like a wonderful person, but he also just sold a startup to Johnson & Johnson earlier. I think it was maybe last year, end of last year. So Johnson & Johnson has a pathological history of buying venture capital funded startup fraud. Like every single company of theirs has a DOJ investigation attached to it. So I hope I'm wrong. Listen, there's nothing I like better than being wrong. I know that people will disagree with that, but I was wrong about podcasts. Here I am. I'm eating fried crow for that. And that's part of it. To me, I feel like if I'm proven wrong, that's great because that helps me grow and become better. The same with Scott for the hashtags. He and I had kind of gone back and forth just privately about, hey, have you thought of this? When I started doing hashtags in 2014, I found that when I put them all together, because of the algorithm at the time, it didn't work as well. Also, again, I was teaching 70 and 80-year-old women how to use Twitter. I am thrilled. I'm thrilled to be wrong about that. I am so glad that Scott's hashtags are working. So I'm wrong. That's fine. I'm happy to admit that. But I just, I hope I'm wrong about Josh on that. But I have to say that I'm not too hopeful in that sense because of my history with Johnson & Johnson. And it's not just to say, blanketly, that is it. If you look at DePuy Synthes, if you look at Cordis, if you look at all these other companies that Johnson & Johnson owns where they bought venture capital funded startups, they are all linked to fraud. So I hope that this is different.
I hope so too, because Josh is one of my favorite podcast guests to listen to, actually.
I like to listen to him as well.
So moving back to Tesla, how did you start following Tesla? Tell us a little bit about that.
I'm trying to remember what it was that he said. Well, in 2014 or 15, I wrote an article about subsidies, and it was out in the LA Times first, and that was one of the things I was fighting with the government about is subsidies. Why are we giving subsidies to criminals? We just keep handing them over and over again, and we expect a different result. We want them to not be criminals. Well, you're giving them money to be criminals. So that was kind of the start of it. And then his ex-wife, Justine Musk, made some sort of comment somewhere about how it's easy to become a billionaire. And somebody had called her out on it, somebody famous, I forget who it was. And she and I had an exchange then on Twitter about that, and then she subsequently blocked me. So, which I always is like, that and being called snarky by the DOJ are like my two crowning achievements in life. So, whenever anybody blocks me like that, I always feel like I'm on the right track, not because I'm being a nuisance, but because what I'm saying is truthful. And Mary Barra also blocked me. Travis Kalanick also blocked me. All of these people have had DOJ criminal investigations. So I feel like I'm on a good streak with that. So
has Elon blocked you yet?
No, and I'm surprised, but I think it's only because I have written about that extensively, and I do know that he is aware of the website. So I won't go into how I know, but I do know. So,
okay.
But so I think that there was something that he did. Oh, what was it? I was trying to remember that today, like what got me kind of really looking at it.
How many? Oh, go ahead.
I know what it was. It was when he shot that car into space. And I was like, what the hell is this guy trying to hide? Like, who is doing, like, what is so wrong with your business that you think this is it? And I write about image versus substance. That was the image that was covering up something big substance wise. So that's what triggered it for me.
Well, one thing that I noted at the time, that was before I was deeply into Tesla Q Twitter. But what I noted was that I think that launch was actually either 1 or 2 days immediately before Tesla's quarterly financial results, which I have started to
track.
I no longer call them quarterly earnings reports for Tesla because they've only had positive earnings for 4 quarters out of 64 or whatever. But yeah, it was literally like a day before the first quarter 2018 fourth quarter 2017 earning or financials came out. So that timing triggered my brain, and that incident of timing being so coincidental between his companies was actually a major contributor to what ultimately pushed me into Tesla Q Twitter, along with, of course, the July 15th, 2018 tweet from Elon where he called Vern Unsworth a pedo. And then, and of course, the Martin Tripp incident and the doxing of Montana Skeptic and funding secured. All that stuff helped prod me along, and is part of why this podcast exists. So
I think that's great, though, and I think that that's the big thing is that we count on media a lot for things, and I'm really tough on media, and I know that people don't like it, but from the perspective of a sealed whistleblower, and there are hundreds out there every day that are trying to get their stories out there. The media does not pay attention until the tipping point has already happened, until there is a DOJ known investigation, until whistleblowers get so fed up, they literally snap on Twitter. That is where the media needs to do a better job and to help source some of this stuff before. There's 2 ways that I think that media can help whistleblowers. One is obviously before, and then one is after. So if you look at the case with Julie Brown and Epstein, that case was closed, and that woman dug and dug and dug and got that investigation reopened. That is a journalist. Somebody who breaks a story before there's a DOJ press release or before there's a known DOJ criminal investigation, that's nice, and it's really great that you're getting it out there. But the people who are under seal need help before that, in order to protect society, to protect consumers and to protect shareholders and the general public. These stories need to break sooner, and more journalists have to be willing to do the investigative work.
Of course, the other side of that is the editors that might hold back a story that a journalist has, and needing to corroborate multiple sources. I don't know if you really need multiple sources in some cases, but I think that's the general rule. So that might be part of
there's that.
Them back.
There is that, and there's also the financial component. That listen, it's hard when Wall Street Journal has a relationship with Johnson & Johnson for them to write a negative Johnson & Johnson story. So I get that, but I also think that journalists can leak some of those things to other news sources that are out there. And I know that, Elon thinks that Twitter is a battlefield or whatever it is, a war zone. I think it's the best source of news. I think it is the fastest way to get news. It beats news organizations. It's unfiltered, unedited, and unspun. That is what you want. So I think that if we can pay attention to that and filter some of that, it's better. I've also been super harsh on John Carreyrou. I don't even know if I'm saying that right, from Bad Blood. He missed the biggest part of that story, which is the venture capitalist. He did exactly what the VCs wanted. They made Elizabeth Holmes to be the scapegoat. I call it the Fed fall. We knew she was going to take the Fed fall, but why aren't you? You can point to 10 people and they can tell you who Elizabeth Holmes is, the lineup. Can you tell me even 3 of the VCs that were on the board?
Sadly, I feel like I try to keep up with things pretty well, but I couldn't name a single one.
Nobody can. That's the problem. So that's not a dig at you by any stretch, but that's the point that I'm trying to make with that, is that you've got to go after the money in that situation. And in my case, they weren't able to get the VCs because they were very smart. Again, they got an easily manipulated CEO and a VP of sales that took the Fed fall for them. So they made sure that the paper trail died before it got to them. And I remember that conversation with the FBI when they called and told me that they had arrested my former CEO and VP of sales. And what they don't tell you is just as important as what they do tell you. And there's inflection when he uses my name. There was, all these sorts of things that he had said, Melayna, we have arrested and indicted. And there was these pauses. And I was like, okay, well, what about John Chang? What about, Josh Macauer? What about NEA? What about, and they're like, Johnson & Johnson has decided to help in the investigation, meaning everybody from there on flipped on the executives. So that's as far as they could go up the food chain. It doesn't mean that the fraud doesn't exist there, but the DOJ has to be able to prove it. So in the case with Theranos, I don't think that they were able to prove it, but I do think, and I'm super hopeful, that they're going to be able to do that with Uber. That Uber should have never been able to IPO because they're under multiple DOJ investigations right now, still for 4 of it, I think it is. But what I am hopeful that they're doing is that while they're getting all this other stuff together, they're going to go after the VCs that knowingly and willingly fund this fraud. So
back to Tesla a little bit. What you may have to speak in some pretty big generalities here, but with how have you helped Tesla whistleblowers? I'll just ask it like that and let you go wherever you're able to go with that question.
I think the biggest thing is that you feel very isolated as a whistleblower. That's by design. The government doesn't want you talking. Your attorneys don't want you talking, that sort of thing. I think it's just knowing that there's somebody that understands what you're going through is the biggest thing. It's like a sort of a virtual hug where there's probably not a week that goes by that I don't cry on the phone at least 6 times with somebody that's going through this process. So
6 times?
Oh yeah, every week. Wow. It is somebody. So whether it's from the aviation industry, so it's very timely that I just got something on the FAA, that there is always somebody that is going through this. And I think one of the biggest things is that when people will reach out to me privately, including whistleblowers, I'll keep it general for this, but where they're like, that sociopathic business model, I knew what I was feeling was wrong and I knew what they were doing was wrong, but I couldn't articulate it. I was the same way. That's why I created it. I knew that what was going on was wrong. I was told that I couldn't sell anymore. They couldn't tell me how they were getting quotas. I'm like, but none of this is making sense. So everybody around fraud there's crazy making around it. Everyone feels like a lunatic around fraud, but the people who are committing it sleep like babies at night. It's a really unfair sort of situation to be in. So I think that, and again, I'm speaking in what has been told to me, and I'm very, very just blessed when I feel that people feel comfortable enough to share this. But I think it's the idea that they don't feel alone. They get that somebody can finish their sentences. They get that somebody can take what the fraud that they've discussed and dial it out 6 more spaces and say, okay, look for this. Now look for this. Now look for this. Contact your attorneys and do this, this, and this. I'm not an attorney. I don't want to be an attorney. Part of the issue is that attorneys are also used to just taking what companies give them. If you're in a negotiation or a settlement, even the government, this is what you get. You don't have to do that. Everyone always says the Department of Justice does not negotiate with terrorists. Bullshit. They do every single day with companies that are committing fraud, that are harming and killing people. And I think that that's what I tried to get whistleblowers to see, is that you don't have to accept what the government gives you. You don't have to accept what the company gives you. if you can do this two-pronged approach, which is the forced accountability, public exposure of negative truthful information for the safety and protection of others, along with the federal intervention, to get recalls all the way down to prison, that's the way we create small incremental change that's sustainable. That's the goal. So I think it's getting them to see that, or they see it when they call me and are like, this finally makes sense. It's that light bulb moment is good. One of the people told me, and like I literally, I know it's silly, but I cry like when people tell me these stories, that somebody online had put that that it resonated with them so much that they laminated it and hung it in their workroom. Their workroom lunchroom, so all the managers could see it. Like I literally had tears. I was like, oh, like that's what it's about for me. It is when it resonates with people and I know that it's helping people. And Bloodsport just sent me something the other day that I'm like, dude, I know you're gonna make fun of me, but I'm totally bawling right now. And he's like, look, the sociopathic business model made it organically in a thread. And I was like, I'm like, finally, like it's not about me. It's about what it can do to help somebody else that's in that situation. So when those things happen, it's a huge win for me.
So if you had a message to send to any existing or future whistleblowers, would you say that you have enough bandwidth to hear their story still today?
Yes and no. I will say that I'm bad at managing expectations because I want to help everybody. And there's two sides to this. There's people that want to tell you their story but don't want to get their hands dirty. Here, do the story. You assume all the risk. I'm going to give you some stuff, but I don't want to be involved. That's fine, but you can't expect me to take that risk if you're not willing to take the risk. You got to put skin in the game. The other part is that people will give me tips on things and then they get frustrated that I don't write it fast enough. I'm not writing at the same pace on the website that I once was, which was like an article a day for a while. I can't keep that pace up and try to talk to people and do 6 other things. So, and I'm also working on the book portion of this. So, I would say that, yes, I want to be able to help everybody, but I think that at the very least, it's to get you in touch with somebody that can help you. So whether it's an attorney, whether it's, whether it's more people like you, whether it's an EEOC claim versus a whistleblower claim, those sort of things. I make no money off of that. I cannot legally, I like to put that out there. I cannot legally make money off of that because I am not an attorney. So if people come to me, it is just me helping them because that's what people should do, is try to help people who are in a bad situation that you understand better than anybody.
But you would be able to point them in some of the right directions. Absolutely.
No, and I have probably 6 different whistleblowers over the last probably 2 years, to my understanding, have found good homes. So we'll put it that way.
Good homes.
Yes, good homes with good attorneys. And that's a big thing too. I write a lot about abusive and non-abusive. That's in everything. So there are good attorneys, there are bad attorneys. It's hard to know which are which. I was very fortunate in my process that my final attorneys for the whistleblower case were not thrilled about me doing the website, but at the end of the day, they saw the advantage. So my case is one of the fastest settled in U.S. history, and it's because I wrote about it every single day. And that's what you have to do. You have to, the DOJ is like, we could hold feet to the fire. I'm like, not fast enough. People's lives are destroyed in this process. I'm lucky to be standing, and some days I barely am still. So I think that it's to understand what these people go through, like the Martin Tripps, the Christinas, the Annas, the Carls from the Tesla side. I get super teary when I see like those GoFundMes because you have no idea like what $2 means to people at that time in their life. Like $2 is huge. And I have to say that I am so inspired by the Tesla Q crowd and all that they've done. So for SCA and for it is amazing because criminals always have more money than their victims and they see to it. And we're seeing it now with Christina where, Tesla's playing games. They're going back and they're rewriting history again and they're, changing the rules. It'll bury her. It'll take 2 years to get through this, and they know that. So I think that for people to understand that it's not just about her. She has a bit of a language barrier. She's a remarkable woman. I think that there's some things that get misconstrued in that, but I think that she realizes this isn't about her. It's bigger than her. Yes, the defamation was made to her, but it is about what companies do and how they abuse people who come forward and expose negative, truthful information. So I have to say that for all that, Tesla Q is, that's probably the most inspiring thing that I have seen, is just a community pulled together from all walks of life. I mean, I have nothing to do with FinTwit. You guys will forget in a day more than I will ever learn, and you've all taught me in a lifetime. So I think that that you see all these different people coming in. There's people who have the aviation side. Like, I love it. It is fascinating from like a sociology standpoint, and then it is truly inspiring from somebody who went through it and was completely isolated during that time. So to see what these guys have, I just would ask that you continue, even if it's little notes to them, or keep cheering them on, or help them get stories if you can. I mean, whatever you can do to help them keep these stories out there. And part of the thing that media does is that they will say, well, we've done that story. You haven't done that story until there are no more victims. That's when the story is done. So,
speaking of stories, did you read the recent Matt Klippenstein article about Tesla entering whistleblower hell?
I think I read part of it. I don't think I got all the way through it yet.
Do you think that's an apt description of maybe where Tesla's entering now, their newest level of hell?
Yeah, but it's self-induced. Like when you see it like that sometimes, and again, I don't recall exactly the context of it, but I think that when you see it that way, it looks like they're angry, disgruntled employees. When you're like, oh, it's whistleblower hell, like everyone's coming forward. You and I both know it's different because we follow Tesla Q. But people who are outside of that look at it and think, oh, they've got a bunch of angry people who, are just complaining. No, people are dying. People are getting injured. OSHA has been out there more than, what is the statistic on OSHA? I forget. Anna had said it was something like it's 3 or 4 times what any other company has experienced in OSHA calls. Like, there are issues.
Yeah, and I saw something today about apparently it was a Tesla policy in some locations to not call 911 or something crazy like that.
She had said that they, and again, so you have to think of it from the same standpoint, is that you get in trouble if you do what's right. So you get in trouble if you call 911. I got in trouble if I reported that there were adverse events. People who work at Tesla probably get in trouble if they know that there's something wrong with autopilot and you point it out. They don't want you to do that. So that tracks. And I guess for me, it's fantastic that they're entering whistleblower hell. It should be. I just am ready for him to go to prison, though. Like, I really, really, I also have another hashtag for that, which I will spare you. But yeah, I just think that that it's getting old is what it is, because it's not just, oh, there's a little fraud here, there's a little fraud here. It is a pathological history of fraud that is harming people.
Indeed. Well, we've been talking for over 70 minutes now, so I think we'll call it. We'll wrap up the regular episode, but I would encourage everyone to become a patron and continue listening to what we're about to talk about. We're going to get maybe a little bit deeper into the Tesla specifics, but only for patrons. So you can go to patreon.com/TeslaQpodcast and make a monthly contribution. Also, if you want to purchase that excellent mug with Melayna's quote on it, you can go to evacuationboy.com. Also, there's the Shock Market store from Trish. I forget exactly what the URL is for that, but she's got some great artwork on there. Any final words from you, Melayna, for the regular podcast episode listeners?
I really do want to thank everybody from Tesla Q who has been so kind to help me understand. Like I said, there's like Gabe taught me what the Q was in Tesla Q at first. I didn't know it stood for bank. This all started out. So obviously Tesla charts, there's so many, Evacuation Boy, there's so many to thank for the time that you've given me and really helped explain things. I understand how fraud relates to all this, but I don't necessarily always understand the financial side from FinTwit, and y'all have been amazing, and I truly appreciate it.
No problem. We're glad to have you. And we'll call that episode number 40 of the Tesla Q podcast. Thanks for listening, everybody. Bye-bye.